Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now a little past midway in our third season, and we remain just as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and to sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung, heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show, the first of our monthly series on chemicals, hazardous and toxic waste and materials. They're all around us. Their effects on the environment of these toxic substances that we use and that we put into it. And, you know, there's an old saying that we've all heard that says, what you don't know can't hurt you. But that is not always good advice, especially as we talk about chemicals, hazardous, and toxic materials. When it comes to toxic substances, what you know can help you instead. And some examples of some of the things that we didn't know that have and do hurt us are like the radon in some basements, lead in drinking water, exhaust from cars, and chemicals released from landfills. And these are just but a few examples of some of those toxic substances that can hurt us. And by understanding how we can reduce our exposure to chemicals and reduce our risk of harmful health effects as well as our harm to the environment. So what do we mean when we say toxic substances? Well, it's a substance that can be poisonous or can cause health effects and harm our environment and stop our environment as well as the elements of it from working as they're supposed to. Now, people generally are concerned about chemicals like PCBs and toxin gases, which can be found in some hazardous waste sites and some other obvious toxins. However, the products that we use every day, such as household cleaners, prescription and over-the-counter drugs, gasoline, alcohol, pesticides, fuels, and cosmetics can indeed be quite toxic. Really, just about any chemical can be toxic or harmful under certain conditions. Now, chemicals can be toxic because they can harm us when they enter our body or when they come in contact with our body. And exposure to toxic substances such as gasoline can affect our health. Since drinking gasoline can cause burns, vomiting, diarrhea in very large amounts, it can also cause drowsiness or death, then indeed it is unequivocally toxic. Now, some chemicals are hazardous because of their physical properties. They can explode all over us, burn us, or react easily with other chemicals and become very, very dangerous. And since gasoline is one of these that can burn and its vapors can explode, then again, gasoline is quite hazardous. A chemical can be toxic or hazardous or both. So since chemicals can be so toxic, then it seems like it's quite important to understand how they can affect our health and the environment around us, the environment that sustains us. And this is why we must care about this. And to care about it is not optional. It's a necessity. Now, some substances are more toxic than others. The toxicity, or in other words, how harmful a substance is described by the types of effects it causes as well as its potency. How harmful toxic substances are is also dependent upon the dosage that we may be exposed to, the level of exposure, the route of exposure to us, the exposure medium, the length of our exposure to it, as well as some other factors. And then all people are not equally sensitive to chemicals and therefore are not affected by them in the same way. Some people like myself who have allergies and other issues are more sensitive. And also people who have other issues and conditions, both known and unknown, are going to have higher sensitivity. And then some people have higher sensitivity thresholds. But the chemicals, hazardous and toxic waste and materials in our environment do affect us all by way of our health and by way of degradation of the environment, this precious environment that sustains us all. Now, that also our cancers are on the rise is an example of a delayed health effect, or can be an example of a delayed health effect of exposure to toxic waste and materials. Cancer, any cancer, is the uncontrolled growth and spread of abnormal cells in the body. And there are many, many, many kinds of cancers. And cancers can be caused by a number of things, of course, but also including the exposure to some toxic substances that we have studied, such as benzene and asbestos and lead and some others that we hear about. So you see, what you know can help you, or it certainly can help you avoid some things. Now, all of this is a lot. But here today to help us explore and unpack this are some experts that we know will really be able to shed a lot more understanding on this for us. Today we have with us Jennifer Horney, who is with the University of Delaware, and we have Emily Rogers, who is with the USPIRG. And we're very glad to have these ladies. Now, Jennifer is a professor and founding director of the epidemiology program at the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. Her research focuses on measuring the health impacts of disasters. Jennifer is currently a member of the Board of Scientific Counselors for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and their Center for Preparedness and Response, and she's a member of the Publications Board of the American Public Health Association. Dr. Jennifer Horney is part of the Public Health Response to Hurricanes team, and she has been on the team for Hurricanes Isabel, Charlie, Hurricane Katrina, Wilma, Irene, and Harvey. And with those, she conducted rapid assessments of disaster impacts on individual health as well as community health. Welcome, Jennifer. We're so glad you could make time to be with us today. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great. And Emily is with the USPIRG's Zero Out Toxics, and she is the advocate for that program with them. Emily works to protect our health and environment from toxic chemicals, overseeing USPIRG's programs to clean up toxic Superfund sites, to protect the public from health and toxic chemicals in consumer products, and reduce the use of pesticides and other health threats from toxins. USPIRG works across the country, and the various state entities employ close to 400 organizers, policy analysts, scientists, and attorneys, as well as they employ an army, so to speak, of federal lobbyists, and they lobby in Washington, D.C. to be strong advocates for us for these issues. Emily, did I get all this right? And will you tell us just a wee bit more about USPIRG and what it stands for?
Sure. Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. And we pronounce it USPIRG, and it stands for the Public Interest Research Group. So we are a advocacy organization that works on issues that the public is concerned about, and we advocate for them at the legislative level, as well as organize communities around issues and bridge the gap between people who may disagree on other things but can come together over common sense issues such as toxic chemicals affecting their communities.
Well, thank you for giving us that more expanded explanation and description of what you all do. And it seems like your public interest work is very necessary and has expanded a while. We're going to go to break, and we'll be right back on the other side with Jennifer Horney from the University of Delaware and Emily Rogers from USPIRG to really begin to unpack and dig into today's show on the effects of toxic substances that we use and put into our environment. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, Sunflower Shops, and many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens. Serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. To today's show on chemicals, hazardous and toxic wastes and materials all around us, the effects on the environment, specifically today of toxic substances that we use and that we put into it. And we are back with Dr. Jennifer Horney from the University of Delaware and Emily Rogers from US PIRG. Again, welcome, ladies, and we really do appreciate you being with us today. As we unpack this and delve into this, I want to start with Jennifer. Jennifer, can you talk to us about what are the most common harmful toxic substances to the environment, and where do they come from? That is, how do they get into our environment, and what are the effects they have on the environment?
So I'm not a chemist, so I'm not a very big expert on this. The toxicants that I generally study in my work are things that are introduced into the environment because of either human activity or disasters. So we might think that if there's a flood around an industrial waste site or an industrial facility, that some of that flood water might be contaminated with some of the toxicants, the chemicals, pesticides, carcinogens, volatile organic compounds that are worked with there. And so many people, particularly in large cities, live in fence-lined communities so that they might be exposed to some of those chemicals if there was a flood. So I primarily deal with things like those pesticides, volatile organic compounds like benzene, and then also heavy metals that may be in the environment due to either our typical transportation and other infrastructure or some sort of industrial process.
And so of these, though, that you are familiar with, what do you consider, I guess, again, the most common, most harmful? Because there are a lot of very harmful things, but they're not that common. And so I want to kind of filter out what are the most common that are harming the environment.
Yeah, it really depends, I think, on the community where you live.
Geography.
So, we work a lot in communities in East and Southeast Houston, and they happen to be in neighborhoods that are adjacent to refineries, metal recyclers, and other types of facilities. So therefore, we're mostly looking for heavy metals and volatile organic compounds that are produced when things like petroleum are refined. But in other areas nearer to where I live now, we might be looking at something like PFAS or fracking wells that haven't been properly capped. So it really depends on where you are living as to what the most harmful exposures might be.
Emily, I want to jump to you on this one, on two sides of it, really. From your work and what you know of, what do you see as the most harmful toxic substances to the environment first? And then I want to talk about health.
Yeah. So the two are they are inextricably linked.
Right.
So you can have toxic chemicals or substances that are naturally occurring or man-made. So naturally occurring substances that are toxic, examples of those are lead or asbestos or arsenic. So those occur naturally, and in the environment and are out there. But there are also man-made examples of toxic chemicals. Like Jennifer mentioned, PFAS is one of the really big classes of chemicals. It's over 12,000 different types of chemicals, and they're all man-made, so they wouldn't exist if we hadn't created them. Other examples are, types of pesticides and other petrochemicals as well. So like Jennifer said, it really depends on, where you are in the States and the world. But PFAS specifically is a chemical class of chemicals that I work a lot on, and it's in a lot of consumer products. So I would say that's maybe in my world, it seems like one of the most common chemicals that is used in a variety of consumer products and really has wide-reaching effects for all of us.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about PFAS on this show, too, especially in our plastic pollution month and some other months. But what's amazing to me, and I don't know, you guys can weigh in on why do you think this is, the public, most of us, recognize, gasoline exhaust, like I had mentioned earlier, or coming in contact with gas out in the environment, radon, lead poisoning, and mercury poisoning even. But I don't think that there's a widespread perception or knowledge or realization, or maybe I should say acceptance of PFAS as being the harmful, hazardous, toxic material that it is.
From my perspective, I think we still have a lot of educating to do on PFAS and informing the public of where this chemical is used, what consumer products where it's used in, and also other pathways of exposure to it. Because it is so ubiquitous and used in so many products, my job is to educate people on where they can come in contact with this and how to reduce exposure, which at this point is pretty hard because it is so ubiquitous. And I'm sure Jennifer has some input as well.
I think perhaps too, and then we'll move to Jennifer. Maybe as I was mentioning at the intro to the show, is some materials can cause great harm through one exposure. Some other materials take a lot of exposure, and then even on another level, some things take a long, long time for their effects to show up, like most cancers. And I suspect that maybe that's the reason that the public perhaps does not recognize the alarming implications of all the PFAS all around us.
And unfortunately, that's true in a lot of toxics work. We approach chemicals in a way in which they are allowed onto the market before we know their long-term health effects. And so a lot of my work is focused on advocating for a precautionary approach when it comes to chemicals. We always say that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We should make sure that chemicals are safe before they're put onto the market and before, the wider population is used as an experiment to find out whether they're safe or not.
Indeed.
It also has to do with how visible things are to people. I mean, you can see the exhaust coming out of the car. You can see debris and other things in the water, and then you can think, okay, well, maybe this is quote unquote contaminated. But there are a lot of things that we can't see, and then therefore maybe not take the right precautions.
Indeed, and that's one of the things I want to talk with you all about as we move forward in our conversation today, and that is other ways or that people might be able to tell or to know that they have been or that they are being exposed to hazardous and toxic materials and substances. But I want to move back for a moment to Jennifer. And I know that your area of expertise, again, is environmental hazards that are associated with disasters. Can you talk to us about how that has changed over the years, over the last 5 to 10 years, how the nature of the disasters have changed, the implications and the harm? How is that changing? What are we seeing and why?
So I think the main thing that we're seeing is more frequent and severe disasters. So whereas we would expect and, we calculate insurance premiums and flood risk based on the idea that some certain area may be at a risk 1 in 100 years of having a flood. We now see those floods annually or every 2 years. So the severity and frequency of disasters has definitely increased. Then over the last 2 years, of course, we've had hundreds of concurrent disasters, wildfires, floods, hurricanes, at the same time that responders were also addressing the impacts of COVID-19. So I think we've really seen an intensification of that. And we know from lots of research that being exposed to multiple disasters is harder on people, their mental health and their physical health, than a single disaster which they may experience.
And I want to talk we only have a couple of minutes to go before we go to break, but I do want to talk a little bit more about concurrent disasters. And I think you gave an example, but I want to go back to, again, another example of concurrent disasters and how they affected health and environment so that people know or get a sense of the impact of this.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of good examples. If we think about the hurricanes that hit Louisiana in the summer of 2021, we can't use the same kinds of protective actions we normally would. We can't send people to big congregate stadiums and say, because we're telling people to socially distance and wear their masks and stay away from people. And then there's actually a good bit of evidence showing, so for example, people who are exposed to wildfire smoke, that actually impedes their immune response and makes them more susceptible to being infected with COVID, and if they're infected, more susceptible to a more severe case. So we have that double jeopardy of not really being able to evacuate in the way that we had, and then if you aren't able to evacuate and you're exposed to the smoke, it's going to intensify your risk for another respiratory condition like COVID and intensify your infection if you are infected.
That's a lot, and there's not much we can do about most of those concurrent disasters, except maybe be as prepared as we can. And I think Emily said that's a lot of what they do. And so I want to dig into that a little bit more too, because it seems like some of this, or a lot of this, we should be able to pre-prepare for once we have accepted it and know that it's coming. So we'll be right back on the other side of the break to continue this very informative discussion with Jennifer Horney with the University of Delaware and Emily Rogers with U.S. Purge. Thank you, ladies. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on chemicals, hazardous and toxic waste all around us. And specifically today, we're talking about the effects on the environment of toxic substances that we use and that we put into it. And again, we are back with Dr. Jennifer Horney with the University of Delaware and Emily Rogers with U.S. Purge. Thank you, ladies. And we want to continue some of the conversation we were having with Jennifer right before the break, and again, talking about these concurrent disasters. And you've given us an example of some, the latest of which involved COVID and everything else. And it's my sense that more of this is coming, and that we should have some toolkits that people can use for this. But with that, I want to ask you, what are you seeing, both of you, I'll start with Jennifer and then we'll talk with Emily on this. What are you seeing as the emerging disaster threats to our environment? You guys are in the field, Jennifer does research. What do you see coming that has not been let out of the barn yet, as we say here in Texas?
We're seeing a number of sort of new strains of different diseases that may be emerging or re-emerging. And while we might struggle to connect those with environmental exposures, it's actually really clear that as climate change, vectors of disease move into new areas, as we cut down forests or otherwise change the environment, the same thing happens. And so we have more interactions with animals And we also have a shrinking world. You can get on a plane and fly around the world to, anywhere in pretty much 24 hours, which also allows us to move those vectors of disease. So taking care of the environment, and it's a little bit of a different way than what we've been talking about before, but it's really essential to keep those emerging and re-emerging infections at bay. So that's what we're thinking about.
Indeed. Emily, what are you all seeing out there as possibly emerging threats in terms of chemicals and toxic and hazardous substances?
Yeah, a big focus of ours are cleaning up Superfund sites, which a lot of them that are on our coastlines are in the paths of major hurricanes. And with hurricane season officially starting tomorrow, that's definitely a big concern of ours. Because these sites, even sites that have been remediated or have been cleaned up, are at risk of coming into contact with major weather events and the toxic waste within those sites being spread out to the larger community.
Getting stirred up by some of those horrific and unseen in the past hurricanes, tornadoes, and all of those things.
Yes, exactly. So we are focused on getting resources out to communities who may be in the line of or the path of those storms, and making sure that people are as prepared as possible, as well as advocating for legislation to clean up those sites, for funding to clean up those sites more quickly, because there is a severe lack of funding within the Superfund program. So that's one of our major areas of focus is making sure that there's legislation in place that ensures the funding of cleanup of toxic waste sites across the country.
Are there any specific Superfund sites that you guys are or have your eyes on that you're really concerned about because of where it lies, perhaps in the path of something or something else that could concurrently just really exacerbate that situation?
There are a lot of sites, actually, that are in the path. So sites in coastal states. Texas has a lot of sites. California has the second most sites. New Jersey has the most toxic waste sites, Superfund toxic waste sites in the country. So there's definitely concern in all those coastal states, as well as states in the center of the country as well.
Emily, can you give us the names of some of those sites so people can know what we're talking about and be aware of it?
I don't have any sites that are coming to mind right now.
But I meant like nuclear power plant sites?
Oh, yeah. There are sites, nuclear power plants are definitely worrisome. Any kind of lagoons or sites that store hazardous waste, such, on farms or near industry, chemical processing plants. They often store waste in lagoons that can flood, or there's been examples over the years of those lagoons having leaks and being concerned around those leaks turning into major disasters.
Indeed. Let me jump to Jennifer. In your disaster work, have you come across some specific sites that have been breached or that you all are worried about?
Yeah, so in Hurricane Harvey, a number of the Houston area, Harris County sites were flooded, including the San Jacinto River waste pits and other sites, former oil refineries, production areas for creosote and other chemicals. Also in other hurricanes, like in Hurricane Florence, as Emily was mentioning, so the waste, the ash from coal-fired power plants is wet down and stored in ponds that have earthen dams. Those dams break during floods and hurricanes. And while not designated as the Superfund site as of yet, there are also many other designations that industrial sites and former industrial sites can give, that they're either on the toxic release inventory, they're a Superfund site, they're underground tank sites, there are municipal landfill sites. And so you can find any of those just by looking on the EPA website, Superfund, and you'll find a list of any that may be in your state.
Yeah, and that's a point I was wanting to get over, which is why I was belaboring this, is that people may not be aware of the sites, but you might say, oh, it's a Comanche nuclear plant or whatever. But they would recognize some of the names if they were told, and they could, connect those dots, yes. And then begin to advocate in their community for proper preparedness for those sites. Now, the next thing, though, I want to talk with both of you all about, and we've touched upon it a little bit, but I want to dive in on the intersection of climate change on our exposure. And what I'd like to do is starting with you, Emily, is if you can just connect the dots for our listeners on where climate change intersects with environmental exposure to toxic chemicals and materials and our own exposure to toxic chemicals and substances.
Yeah. A lot of toxic chemicals leach into our environment and then come back and affect our health. So an example of that is lead in drinking water. So we use lead to make pipes, and that lead has leached into a lot of drinking water and then exposes us to that lead. So there's a pathway. Another example of climate change specifically causing exposure pathways is, again, with storms. There may be, industrial plants that have storage sites of toxic waste, or they have effluent coming off of their site, their industrial complex, that gets into our waterways when there are major storm events. A lot of storm water systems get overwhelmed during those events, and then it can leach, the toxic chemicals from that can leach into our drinking water and then expose us.
One of them that you mentioned, and we just have a couple of minutes to go before we go to break, is the systems that we rely on every day for good water can become overwhelmed in some of these extreme weather events that we have. Seems like maybe all of these extreme weather events, tornado, hurricane, floods, those three anyway. And we haven't even got to talk about fires yet, which we'll talk about later. But it looks like all of those extreme weather events can overwhelm our systems that keep us with clean, safe drinking water. Now, do we know before the big storm comes, before the big flood comes, that we have these manufacturing or other business neighbors that could easily be flooded or overwhelmed too and spread their toxic materials to us?
Yes. Sometimes we do know, and the issue is getting that information out to the public. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen. So podcasts like this are a perfect way to reach a wider audience and make people curious. I know that when I started doing this work, I was curious what Superfund sites I had come into contact with. And like Jennifer mentioned, the EPA has a really great website where you can go and see what sites are near you and what.
Indeed, and we'll have to try to put that out there at some point too, when people are interested to go and find out. And we just have one more minute to go before we go to break, but we'll be back on the other side of the break to finish this. But I want to kind of throw that question when we come back to Jennifer, because she has worked in a number of disaster sites. Because I have to think that just like the weatherman tells us to, bring in the loose lawn furniture and to make sure we have batteries and coolers and things like that, maybe they should tell us too that ABC chemical manufacturing plant down the road could be overwhelmed, so you better pick up your stuff and move somewhere else or get plenty of water so you don't have to share it. It just seems like to me we're at that point. Anyway, we're going to be right back on the other side of the break with Dr. Jennifer Horney with the University of Delaware and Emily Rogers with U.S. Purge, because they are just making us much smarter. Thank you, ladies. We'll be right back. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens. serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on chemicals, hazardous and toxic wastes all around us. And today we're focusing in on the effects on the environment of those toxic substances that we use and that we put into it. And we are back with Dr. Jennifer Horney with the University of Delaware and Emily Rogers with U.S. Purge. And we are so thankful to have them with us today. They really are expanding our knowledge as well as expanding our awareness and concern about these issues that are just all around us. As one of our guests said a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about probably waste or trees in the environment, that we live in this kind of toxic soup, or in this case, chemical soup. And I want to talk really briefly about what I consider one of the greatest environmental threats of today, and it's disaster related, and that is these wildfires. And they are particularly on the top of my mind and some others because we have been experiencing them here in Texas. And as one of our guests told us probably a couple of years ago, is that they weren't going to stay in Australia and they weren't going to just stay in Northern California. And so we are seeing that. And while that is a natural disaster, they do intersect with the chemicals and toxic waste and materials in the environment. So I want to throw this first to Jennifer in terms of where is that intersection as we anticipate wildfires perhaps moving across our country.
I would start by circling back and saying, sometimes we don't know what used to be in the places we live now. So regardless of whether we're talking about a flood or a fire, if we live by, say, a wetland space, that could have formerly been something else, and it was rehabilitated to become a wetland space. So if we think about fires, I think that we have to consider just all of the sort of regular chemicals that we come in contact with all the time. So what keeps our couches from being flammable and what we treat our carpets with, all the things everyone keeps in their garage or their outdoor shed, pesticides, ant killer, all kinds of things like that. So all of those things especially in a wildland urban interface type of wildfire, those things are going to be combusted. It's not just going to be forests that are going to be burning. So fires can expose people to chemicals in that way. And then also, again, when they're cleaning up, we talked before about the coal ash, but the ash left behind from domestic fires, it can also be contaminated with many of those chemicals that are part of our everyday lives.
And we never can, per se, anticipate when the fire is going to hit, but I think one of the things that we can all take away from that is, again, to watch or be mindful of the products and materials that we use that are in our environment to the greatest degree possible, because those can be and will be affected pretty much by any natural disaster.
Yeah, and as Emily mentioned before, things come on the market and then some things are taken off the market. So we've removed different pesticides and herbicides from the market because we've discovered over time that they weren't safe. But many of us probably still have those old pesticides and herbicides sitting in our garage, and we're still using them because they are effective. They just aren't safe.
As someone said to me, there's a reason you keep them in your garage. Have you ever thought about that? And you don't keep them up on your bathroom sink. So instead of your garage, there's a reason. Think a little bit deeper, as he mentioned to me. Emily, I want to ask you, though, to talk to us a little bit about why people should care and why people must care about toxic chemicals and hazardous waste materials and issues that they create that are not necessarily in their own backyard? Like, why should people care about those Superfund sites sitting over somewhere and all that can happen to them given certain conditions?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a good likelihood that we've all been exposed to toxic substances at one time or another, or are currently being exposed, and we don't even know it. So that's one reason. For Superfund specifically, even if you don't live near a site, one of the big issues with that program is that it's severely underfunded and has fallen to taxpayers to cover the bill when a polluter can't be identified or can't pay to clean up those sites. Originally, the program was funded by taxes on the chemical industry and the petrochemical industry because those are some of the biggest polluters. And our whole campaign around that is to make the polluters pay for that toxic waste cleanup. I'm happy to report that we have gotten one of those taxes reinstated, and that will start on July 1st. The chemical companies in our country will have to pay a tax that covers funding for Superfund sites that have chemicals that the chemical companies are responsible for polluting. So that's a really great win. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten a tax reinstated for the petrochemical industry. So that's something that we're working on. And so when it comes to holding polluters accountable for the messes that we're making, we're not doing a great job just yet. We're working on it, and we're working to get legislation in place that makes sure that the polluters are paying for toxic waste site cleanup instead of taxpayers like you and me.
And going back to Jennifer, can you talk to us a little bit more? And I want to go back to climate change. I know we've talked about it, but I still want to go back to the intersection of climate change and its impact on some of the substances that are already out there in our environment, like some of the forever chemicals even. What may be some impacts there?
I think from my perspective that climate change just increases the already high likelihood that we interact with these types of chemicals and other types of toxicants because of its association with increased frequency and severity of disasters, as well as the need for people to move around. So the types of cities, particularly globally, the types of super cities where the majority of the population is moving to, face huge threats from climate change and sea level rise, as well as other threats like subsidence from pumping too much water for the people who live in these growing metropolitan areas to drink. So that allows seawater to intrude upon wells, which harms farmers, damages drinking water. So I think it really just in every way magnifies our potential exposure to all of these types of toxins and toxins that we're talking about.
I have to think that heat just simply exacerbates chemicals. And as we talked, I think early on, heat can actually induce some chemical and chemical reaction. And with our world getting hotter, that's got to make an impact. Has there been any research on the warming that we're seeing and its effects on some of the common hazardous or toxic materials?
There's actually quite a lot of research on the health impacts of heat waves and increasing exposure to heat, but there's less known about cold, which you just suffered there in Texas with your winter storm last year. And so some of the things that we track very carefully are things like carbon monoxide poisoning in cold weather or in heat waves. If people try and use generators and they don't use those safely, or people may bring in gas grills and other types of inappropriate cooking and heating into their homes and end up with carbon monoxide poisoning. So in a sense, while heat is very dangerous and we want to try and have cooling centers and other resources for people to plan for that, from an environmental perspective, we're just as worried about cold because people are then indoors and can be exposed to some very dangerous things for their health.
Indeed, those unthought about consequences. And we just have a couple of minutes to go in our show. Jennifer, one other thing, too. Is there any work or anything you can tell us about the impact of the environmental toxins themselves on driving climate change?
I don't know that specifically. It's not my area of expertise, but I would certainly assume that, for sure are the types of chemicals that an expanding transportation infrastructure and automobile traffic put into the air are certainly having those multiplicative effects by warming our climate as well as harming our health.
Indeed. And so, Emily, before we leave, could you just talk to us, our listeners, about what are some of the most impactful things that we as ordinary people can do in our everyday lives to help drive solutions to this issue of the harmful chemicals and hazardous waste that we seem to be surrounded by?
Yeah, I think, and we've talked about this, I think one of the great things that people can do is be curious, ask questions, educate yourself on what's surrounding you. Look up the Superfund sites that may be closest to you and your family. And then get involved with organizations. US PIRG has a membership base that supports the work that we do. There are a lot of other great organizations, too, that are working to spread the awareness and around these issues and build support for policies that protect all of us from these toxic chemicals. So supporting work by researchers like Jennifer, as well as nonprofit organizations that are advocating on the public's behalf to ensure that there are sound policies and that our elected officials are paying attention to the fact that we're concerned about this issue and are working to ensure that there's policies in place that will help us address these issues in the long run and for future generations.
That's what I was going to add, that, you should contact your city council, your county commissioner, your state representative, find out if they know what chemicals and other environmental exposures are in their district. And if they don't, you can point them to the places where they can find out.
Oh, thank you for saying it that way. That would be a good campaign for you all to push on, Emily, is have people determined by at the lowest level city council districts. What is the environmental hazard? That can move further. Thank you so much, ladies. We have run out of time, as we always do when we start digging into these important and certainly interesting issues. We have been with Dr. Jennifer Horney with the University of Delaware and Emily Rogers with US PIRG, and they have really made us smarter about these environmental chemicals and toxins and hazardous waste that are surrounding us all and affecting us. Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourselves. And each of those can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week for more on hazardous waste and toxic chemicals, what they're doing to our environment and our health. Thank you.